Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. In this episode, we're looking at product liability. Imagine this: you buy a product, the product is defective, somebody gets injured, who can be sued, and under which legal route? Now, that's what this topic is all about. The good news is that most product liability questions can be answered by asking a single question: are we bringing a negligence claim or a Consumer Protection Act claim? We'll look at both routes as part of this video and, more importantly, understand the advantages and disadvantages of each. Let's get started. So, the big picture: when a defective product causes damages, there are potentially three areas of law that might help: contract law, negligence, Consumer Protection Act 1987. Today we're focusing on the tort routes, negligence and the CPA. These are particularly important where a contract claim is unavailable. For example, the injured person did not buy the product, the retailer has disappeared, there is no contractual relationship. In those situations, tort becomes essential. So the first question, whenever you see a product liability question, is to ask, do I want to prove fault? If yes, then you use negligence. If not, you use the Consumer Protection Act 1987, and that distinction sits at the heart of what we're going to be doing in this video. So route one, let's begin with negligence. This is the traditional route. The famous starting point is Donoghue and Stevenson, but I'm very pleased to tell you, you don't need to memorize snails or ginger beer, you just need to understand the principle. A manufacturer may owe a duty of care to consumers who are injured by defective products. So what must the claimant show? Well, for SQE purposes, the claimant needs four things: a manufacturer, a product, a consumer, no reasonable opportunity for intermediate examination. If those elements exist, a duty of care may arise. Let's break them down. So who is a manufacturer? Now, students often think this only means factories. It doesn't. The concept's wide. Potential manufacturers include producers, repairers, installers, even some suppliers. So the key question is, did this party work on the product before it reached the claimant? If yes, they may fall within the concept of manufacturer. So what counts as a product? Well, almost anything capable of causing damage. So examples would include food, drink, machinery, vehicles, electrical goods, component parts. The law can also extend to packaging, instructions, and associated materials. So who's a consumer? Well, the term is interpreted widely. It does not simply mean the purchaser. The claimant could be the user, a passenger, a visitor, even a bystander. The key issue is foreseeability. So putting it as a question, could the manufacturer reasonably foresee that this person might be injured if reasonable care was not taken? If the answer is yes, they may fall within the class of consumers. Now, what is intermediate examination? Well, students often overlook this, but the idea is really simple. If another person had a realistic opportunity to discover the defect before the product reached the claimant, the original manufacturer may not owe the duty under this rule. So think of a supplier who receives a specific warning to test the product before resale. If that supplier fails to carry out the test, liability may shift. So the key question becomes, who realistically had the opportunity to discover the defect? Now, what losses can be recovered? Now, this is a favourite SQE area. So negligence allows recovery for personal injury and damage to other property, but not the defective product itself. Why not? Because the cost of replacing the defective product is treated as pure economic loss. And as you may have seen in one of our earlier videos, pure economic loss is generally not recoverable in negligence. Next, we've got to then look at proving breach. So we now reach the biggest weakness of negligence. The claimant has to actually prove fault, and that's often difficult. After all, how does a consumer know what happened inside a factory? How does a customer prove exactly where the manufacturing process went wrong? And this is one reason why the Consumer Protection Act became so important. So let's have a look at that Consumer Protection Act now. Now, this is where students should breathe a sigh of relief. Why? Well, because the claimant does not need to prove negligence. The Consumer Protection Act creates strict liability, and that phrase is worth remembering. It means liability without proof of fault. Under the Act, the claimant must establish four things: damage caused by a defect in a product. So notice what's missing here. There's no requirement to prove negligence, no requirement to prove carelessness, no requirement to prove breach of duty, and that's the major advantage of the Act. So what's a defect? Well, the Act focuses on safety. A product is defective if it is not as safe as people generally are entitled to expect. That's the key test. Some students sometimes confuse defective with poor quality. The Act is concerned primarily with safety. Not every disappointing product is defective, but a product that creates an unexpected safety risk may well be. What damage can be claimed? Well, the claimant can recover for death, personal injury, damage to private property, but again, there are limits. You cannot recover for the defective product itself. Again, this is treated as pure economic loss, and business property receives significantly less protection than private property. So who can be sued? Well, under the Act, liability extends beyond traditional manufacturers, with potential defendants including the producer, that will usually be the manufacturer, the own brander. So if a company sells the products under its own brand, they also can be sued. The importer, so if somebody has imported the particular product, they can be the defendant, and certain suppliers, particularly where they cannot identify others within the supply chain. So the range of possible defendants is therefore wider than many students would expect. Why do claimants love the Act? Well, because they do not need to prove fault. So if we compare the two routes, in negligence, the claimant must prove duty, breach, causation, and damage. Under the Consumer Protection Act, the claimant must prove product, defect, causation, and damage. And that is a much easier path. But you knew that was coming. The Act has defences. The defendant is not completely helpless, and a number of statutory defences exist. The most important for SQE purposes is the development risks defence. This applies where scientific and technical knowledge at the time was insufficient to discover the defect. So think of a newly discovered risk in a pharmaceutical product. The defence reflects the idea that manufacturers should not always be liable for risks that nobody in the world could have discovered. Let's quickly touch upon contributory negligence. Just as with ordinary negligence, contributory negligence can still reduce damages under the Act. For example, if a claimant becomes aware of a defect and behaves carelessly, damages may be reduced. So strict liability does not mean limitless liability. So negligence or the Consumer Protection or the Protection Act. This is the comparison students need to be considering here. So negligence has its advantages. It covers property damage generally. It follows familiar negligence principles, but it has the disadvantages that you must prove fault and you must establish breach. Under the Consumer Protection Act, we have the advantages of strict liability, no need to prove fault, and a wider range of defendants. But statutory defences exist, and the defective product itself still remains unrecoverable. So what's Bowdie's bottom line? Well, every product liability problem begins with one question: which route gives the claimant the better claim? Under negligence, you would have to ask the questions about manufacturer, product, consumer, no reasonable opportunity for intermediate examination, and can fault be proved. Under the Consumer Protection Act, you would need to ask about product, defect, damage, and causation. And remember, the biggest distinction of all, negligence requires proof of fault. The Consumer Protection Act creates strict liability. If you can identify which route is available, and which elements need to be proved, you'll be able to deal with the vast majority of SQE product liability questions. Thanks for watching this video in the Bowdie short series. There'll be more videos available soon.